The only source of knowledge is experience. Today, I'm lucky to have someone with over 4 decades of property experience. Current Adelaide University property lecturer and a very successful property investor, Peter Koulizos.
Hello, Nicola. It's a pleasure to be here to help out your first home buyer audience. Yes, I am. I do lecture at Adelaide University in property. I'm semi-retired now, so I only teach 1 day a week. But I've also written a few books. First book was Property Professor's Top Australian Suburbs, which outlined the best suburbs to invest in for capital growth around the country. Second book was Property versus Shares, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of both. And my latest book was The Diary of a Small Developer. But I suspect it's the top Australian suburbs theme, which your audience is probably more interested in today.
Yes, that's what we'll be covering. So we're going to be talking about knowing everything you need to know about buying your first property, whether it's to live in or to invest, getting on the market with prices so high, areas that are set for growth, and loads more. Thank you for Peter for joining me today. We'll start off by asking a few questions. So Peter, why don't we start off with prices being so high? What are some practical ways to get into the property market?
So if people want to get into the property market, the one word people need to remember is sacrifice. So sacrifice means you have to give up something today for the benefit in the future.
Yeah.
And the first thing they need to do is save, because no bank's going to lend you any money unless you have some sort of deposit. Yes, your parents can give you some money, but the bank wants to see some sort of saving. Yeah, your savings regime. So what that means is, and look, I'm not just talking here theoretical, because I have 4 kids myself who are young adults. 3 out of the 4 have already bought homes, but they had to go through this process as well.
Yeah.
So to save a deposit means you're going to have to hold back on the overseas holidays, the flash new car, gathering with your friends at expensive restaurants or cocktail bars. You can still get together with your friends, but maybe you go over to each other's houses and you bring over some food and drink just to keep the cost down. And so if you can save some money in the first instance, then when you have enough money, and enough money might only be just a few $1,000s, you can invest that maybe, say, in the share market or some managed funds, which are even safer, and that'll grow relatively quickly. When I say relatively, compared to what you could physically save. And then, especially with all the generous first homeowner grants and incentives, within a relatively short period of time, and when I say short, property's a long-term game, so short might be 2 or 3 years, you could surprise yourself and find out that you have enough deposit to buy a home, and it might be with the assistance of, say, Home Start, which we have here in South Australia, but you just need to be disciplined, saver, and making that sacrifice.
So being disciplined and making a sacrifice is your main point.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man, because probably the parents of your listeners have said the same thing. But, there is no easy way to do it, because if it was
Unless you sacrifice.
If it was easy, everyone would be buying their own home. But at the moment, only about 70% of Australians own their own home. The rest are renting. So if you're willing to hold back on some of life's niceties now, you can certainly enjoy them later.
Yeah.
Then you need to be saving a deposit.
Okay. So you just spoke about some government incentives and grants. What actually are they?
Yep. So I know your audience is national, so every state has different sorts of grants and incentives. But if we just focus on South Australia, keeping in mind that most of these grants and incentives are only for new homes, not established homes. So probably the biggest game changer in South Australia, and we're following what other states have done, is no stamp duty for first home buyers. But the big difference here in South Australia is there is no cap on the price. So you could be buying a $1.4 million character or period style home as your first home, and there's no stamp duty.
Yeah.
Whereas in many other states, there's a limit. It can't be more than $600,000 or $700,000. So that's certainly a big help. There is an organisation in South Australia called Home Start, which helps people on low incomes. So not everyone can get a loan from Home Start. You have to your income has to be below a certain amount, whether it's as a single or as a couple, and there's a limit to how much you can spend on the home. You can't be buying that $1.4 million character or period style home if you go for a Home Start loan.
You'd have to be below the minimum.
That's right. And the other big incentive, which some state governments have, but now the federal government is going to introduce, is shared equity. So shared equity means you are sharing the ownership of the house.
With, say, a brother, a sister, partner, whatever.
Yeah, on a personal level. But in South Australia and some other states, and very soon around the whole country, you can buy a house with the government.
Okay.
So I'm just going to keep the numbers very simple. All right. So the house might be $1 million, but you can't afford $1 million, but you can afford 700. So you put in 700, the government will own, in inverted commas, the 300.
Yeah.
But it's your own home. Like you make the mortgage repayments, you want to paint it a different colour, whatever, it's no problem.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is when you sell it, you have to give the government back
The 300.
It's 30%.
Yeah.
So, and hopefully it's gone up in value. So their 300,000 that they put in will be greater when they sell it, just like your 700,000 that you put in initially will be greater when you sell it. And in the meantime, if you want, you can slowly buy out the government. So at the beginning it was 70-30,
Yeah.
then you might pay some extra money and it's 75-25. So you could slowly buy them out, or you wait to the end and you just share
When you're selling.
share the profits. Yeah. So look, there are some great opportunities there for first home buyers so far as government grants or incentives are concerned.
So would you be better off paying the bank back or the government?
So if you had some spare money, you'd actually be better off paying the bank back because the interest that you pay is not tax deductible.
Okay.
So, and that way you get to own more of the house anyway, because I'm assuming out of that $700,000 that you put in, if you're a first home buyer, that's certainly not all cash. You would have had to have borrowed most of it.
Yeah.
So you pay back the bank first, but keeping in mind if you might get an inheritance, grandma might die and leave you some extra money.
Yeah.
Well, you have that option to pay out the government as well as to pay out your loan.
So recapping that, shared equity is when you buy in partnership with the government.
Correct. So as we were saying, you own some, the government owns some. You can do it on a personal level where friends buy property, brother and sister buy property, business partners buy property. But yeah, shared equity, as we've just been talking about, is where you share ownership with the government.
So how could we figure out whether we should buy a first home to live in or as an investment property?
Okay, so I think the ideal, and your listeners probably don't want to tell their parents this, the ideal is you stay at home as long as you can.
Yeah.
And you buy that first investment
Because that would
property.
add to your sacrificing of saving.
Yeah, and some people might see that staying at home is a bit of a sacrifice, but if the meals are prepared for you and the washing's done every week, well, that's not a bad situation.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan. You need to get your foot onto the property ladder as quick as you can.
Yeah.
Whether it's investment or whether it's a home.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go to the bank to borrow money, the bank's going to look at you more favourably if it's an investment property because let's say it's a $600,000 property. But if you're buying this $600,000 property and you're going to earn $500 a week in rent, you look much better to the bank than if you're buying a $600,000 property and you're the only one paying off the mortgage. So people need to remember that. So consider you might have to rent it out for 6 months or a year to qualify for the loan, and then later on you might want to move into it, which is exactly what my kids did. So 3 out of my 4 children own a property, but they had to have it as an investment property first, and then when the lease finished, they moved in.
Yeah. So the first thing that came to my mind was that are the government grants still applicable when you're buying an investment property?
No, they're not. So these are generally first home owner grants or incentives. So you have to live in it as a home rather than an investment.
And is there a period you can live in it and then rent it out, say?
There is, and I mean, people would have to speak to their accountant to determine that so far as tax deductibility is concerned and when that can technically happen. But the issue is if you already have an investment property, then for most of the grants and incentives, you won't qualify for
because that's
them.
Considered your property.
That's right.
Your first property.
That's right. So my son last year could buy a house worth up to $550.
Yeah.
Right. Now he could have bought it as a brand new home, get all the first home buyer grants and all of that, but that meant that he would have to live a long way from the city. So it would be in what we call a peri-urban area where the city meets the country.
Okay.
And in Adelaide, that's places like Manapara, Pascagoula, or Sellex Beach, or Aldinga Beach.
Yeah.
But what we did was I helped him buy an established home. When I say helped him, I also put in some money, right, in a suburb close to the beach, because I'm a big fan of buying property close to the city or very close to the beach, because that's where you're going to get most of your capital.
And that's where we'll talk about the best places to buy your first home.
Because I've been involved in property for 40 years, teaching it for 30, so I think I know a little bit about where you should buy. I've written a book on it. Yeah, so big fan of beach or the city. And so we bought a place in West Lake Shore, and now that property has gone up in value in 18 months by 50%.
Wow.
Now, my son was lucky that he had a father that knew a little bit about property.
Yeah, just
and
a little.
so we bought the right type of property in the right location, which is what I would love to talk more about during this podcast. And so I think back, all right, if he bought that brand new house in that peri-urban area, how much would it be worth today compared to buying that established house on a decent-sized block of land close to the sea, and now he's looking at buying a character or a period home in one of the gentrifying inner western suburbs of Adelaide, whereas if he had bought that brand new place, he'd probably still have to be there. So for me, the value in real estate's in the land. So if you want to make money in property, you've got to buy something with a decent block of land.
So then it goes up in value.
Yeah. So he could buy a brand new home in Manapara on 300 square metres of land, or even if it wasn't helping him, he could have bought a 600 square metre home in another suburb of Adelaide, but it would have been a house that was not in very good condition. So that's a sacrifice you have to make. You know, you can go live in a brand new home and do nothing, right? Or you're going to have to make a sacrifice, and maybe on some of your weekends you're going to have to be fixing up the place or pulling out weeds or tearing down trees or painting the house.
Yeah. So back to when you said that it's very important to pick the right area and the right home. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
I certainly can. How many hours we got for this podcast? All right. So the 3 words people need to remember in this podcast is location, land, and looks. The 3 L's, all right? Location is not the only thing in property, but it's the most important thing. And so far as location is concerned, it's proximity to the city or proximity to the sea.
Yeah.
So proximity to the city, why? Because the highest concentration of jobs is in the city. Most people like to live relatively close to work. Now, COVID and work from home has changed that a bit.
Yeah.
And it's now attracting people to more lifestyle areas, which I'll talk about next. But still, the highest concentration of jobs is in the city. So buying close to the city, especially undervalued suburbs. So if we're talking about Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide, these tend to be the western suburbs of those cities.
That are undervalued.
Yeah, because they were generally industrial areas. You know, in very simple terms, the workers lived in the west near the factories, and the bosses lived in the eastern suburbs. But now, like in Adelaide, if I can name some suburbs like Thebarton and Torrensville, these were suburbs that nobody wanted to live in 50 years ago. But now it's very hard to find a house under $1 million. And in Melbourne, suburbs like Yarraville and Seddon have gentrified, but a long time ago people didn't want to live there.
Yeah.
Or in Sydney, Erskineville, Enmore, Newtown, these are suburbs that nobody wanted to live in. Actually, the classic example in Sydney is Balmain, which is on the coast, which was the typical blue-collar area, or Paddington, which was close to the city.
Yeah.
You try and buy there now, you can't, because it's so expensive. So buying close to the city, in particular areas where they have a high concentration of character or period style homes, that's where that word looks come in.
Okay.
All right? So I've talked about the city. Why the sea? Because Australians are obsessed with the beach. One of my international students just did a paper he was testing my hypothesis on, property values grow faster by the sea than not by the sea. And I wouldn't say proved it correct, because it's very hard to prove anything in academia, but he had evidence to show that areas near the beach do much better than areas that are not near the beach.
And what areas are you talking in South Australia near the beach?
So, in South Australia, we'd all have to buy a home in Glenelg or Henley Beach, but that's a bit expensive, especially for first-home buyers.
Yeah.
But I think undervalued areas in beachside suburbs, down south, anywhere from O'Sullivan's Beach down to Moana. You can buy a house, so that leads me into the next bit, the land. So you want to be buying a house. Not everyone can afford to buy a house. All right, buy a townhouse. But
the townhouse will not have the land.
It's got a smaller amount of land, But I said to your listeners they should remember 3 words, right? And they have to remember one phrase. Never, ever buy an apartment as an investment in property. The reason is it doesn't have any land. And remember, it's the land that appreciates in value. The buildings depreciate in value.
Yeah.
And when you buy an apartment, most of your money is being spent in the building, which is dropping in value. Whereas when you buy that house on a decent sized block, even though it's a 50 or 60-year-old house, in many cases, even if the house wasn't on there, the land would still be worth the same. So virtually, in the second scenario, 100% of what you're spending is going into the appreciating component. Whereas if you're buying an apartment,
it's going to depreciate.
Yeah, probably 80 or 90% of what you're spending is going into the building. So just to summarise, location, you want to be buying into undervalued areas close to the city or close to the sea.
Yeah.
You want to be buying something with a land component, whether it's a house or a townhouse, and ideally something that is architecturally appealing, like character or period style homes, or something with a view. Now, the best view you can get is a view of the sea, but it's going to cost a fortune to go live on the Esplanade. The next best view is a view of hills or mountains. Next best view is a view of the city, or at least if you've got a view of a park or an open space. So if your listeners remember those 3 words, in particular location, which is the most important thing, I think that'll hold them in good stead, because your first home is probably not going to be your dream home or your final home. So if you've got aspirations to live in a bigger or better home, where you buy your first home is really important. Yeah.
So location, land and looks is what you should do. What shouldn't you do?
Right. Excellent question, Nicola. I certainly heard some horror stories in my 30 years of teaching in property. Probably the most common one is what I talked about before, is where people buy apartments.
Okay.
Because there are often developers in particular give great incentives for people to buy apartments, like rental guarantees.
Yeah.
And investors thinks that's fantastic. And the banks have an issue with apartments, because often if you want to buy a house, you generally need less of a deposit than if you want to buy an apartment, because the bank also sees it as a risk. And the biggest risk is, well, your apartment is one of 100. 3 or 4 people want to sell their apartment at the same time. How are we going to sell yours if we need to? So the bank's all about risk. They're trying to mitigate their risk. But apartments is one, and the main issue there is the lack of capital growth. The amount of time, if people have got access to CoreLogic, or even if you go to realestate.com, and you can go back and see in a particular apartment building what property's sold for now, if you can find how much that particular property sold for in the past, you'll see that the growth is nowhere near what the growth should be. And you can go check on the ABS, and the ABS will have statistics on houses and units. And you just compare it with the growth of apartments, which are a type of unit, compared to general units, and you will see that in the main, apartments have very limited growth because of what I said before.
No land.
No land. Excellent. If people can just remember that, that's going to hold you in good stead for the future.
And the apartment block will depreciate instead of appreciate.
That's right. And the other problem is the body corporate. So when you buy into an apartment block, people don't understand this. You don't own the whole apartment. You basically own the air within the apartment from the painted walls in, which in one way is good, because if there is a leak in the wall, you're not the one that has to pay for it. Everyone has to chip in and pay for it. But if the problem is, if there is a leak in somebody else's wall, you have to pay for it. Or if there is a problem with the swimming pool or the lifts or the gym. So often apartment blocks have these other facilities, which is wonderful for the tenant that lives in there, but not so wonderful for the owner, because it's the owner's responsibility to pay for the repairs and maintenance.
Yeah.
So now, apartment building might have 100 owners, but if we look at a more realistic situation where there might be a group of 4 or 6 or 8 units, you still have a body corporate. So you're not in control of your own home. So far as what not to do is concerned, definitely don't buy an apartment. And if you're going to buy into a, say, community title or strata title, there's lots of those around the country, you need to check the paperwork, the body corporate paperwork. And in particular, how much money is there in the sinking fund? So the sinking fund is like an account where there's some money in. So if the Gutters need repairing.
Yeah.
There's a few $1,000s to do that. Or if a driveway needs replacing, there's a few $1,000s to do that. So if you can see a good amount of money in the sinking fund and you read the minutes of the meetings and you can see that, well, there's not a lot of repairs and maintenance going on here, then that's good. But if you can see that virtually every meeting they're talking about repairs and maintenance that needs to be done, there's hardly any money in the sinking fund, you probably want to find another property.
So we previously did an episode on community strata and Torrens titles. I remember a little bit about special levies. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So we said that there are body corporate fees.
Yeah.
So there are fees that pay for insurance, which is a big one. Everyone puts in, and there's also part of that should be going to a sinking fund to help pay for things like replacement of gutters or gardening or replacement of windows or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But sometimes they have this thing called a special levy. And this is more common now. So people might remember that huge fire they had in London where the aluminium siding went up in flames, and unfortunately a lot of people lost their lives. Well, all around the world, people are checking the outside linings of their buildings.
Okay.
And if they don't comply, they need to change them. And guess who has to pay for that? The owners of those apartments.
Yeah.
So even though they were all fine when you bought it, there are new regulations that have come in, and now you need to deal with it. Now, that's very unlucky, but generally people are going to have an issue somewhere down the line as the building gets older because things need to be replaced.
Yeah.
Like roofs, the big ones. Maybe there is sewerage issues there's a multitude of problems that can go wrong.
So say the sinking fund doesn't have enough money. What do I have to pay, say, the $200,000?
That you have to pay. So let's say it's $2 million worth of works and there are 10 owners, that's $200,000 each.
That you just need to pull out from
You've got
somewhere.
to find it from somewhere. You go to the bank and borrow the money.
And people will try to sell, but no one's going to buy an apartment with liability.
Because not only do they have to pay you for the apartment, but they know there's another $200,000 that they have to spend. So, look, if people just remember don't buy apartments, then you'll be okay.
Most of us dream about buying a house we love, Peter. But we also want to make sure it's a good investment. After everything you've just said about apartments and understanding a first home owner's budget, how do we balance the two of where we want to live and a good investment?
Excellent question, Nicola. So I'll give you my personal story, if you like.
Yeah.
So now we live in a dream home. It's a beautiful character home in a gentrifying inner western suburb. It's big because I had 4 kids. But that wasn't my first home. My first home, or our first home, was a 2-bedroom transportable home in the country because that's where I got my first job. So before I was a university lecturer, I was a primary school teacher.
Yeah.
And so we had a choice. We could either rent or we could buy. Now, my father was in real estate, and the one thing that he would always tell me was, rent money is dead money. And so because it was both my wife and I buying, which is a similar case now, most of the time you need 2 incomes to buy a property. And it was no different 40 years ago when we bought our first house. We could afford to buy because between us we had enough deposit and the mortgage repayment was going to be a little bit more than the rent.
Yeah.
And I knew I was going to be there for several years, so we bought the house. But that's not the house that I would have chosen to have lived in forever. But that's the only thing that we could afford at the time. And so, thankfully, I listened to Dad, because he knew a lot about real estate. So I made sure I bought a house on a good-sized block of land.
Yep.
The house could be improved upon, with a paint job and a bit of an extension. And because we held the place for a number of years, it went up in value. And so because it went up in value, we were then able to move to our second, bigger and better home. But same thing, this next home also had a big block of land. It was 900 square metres of land in a gentrifying inner western suburb. It was a cream brick house, which is nothing special. It was built in the 1960s, wasn't a character house. But you could improve it, and we did. We did extensions, we did renovations. We held it for a long time, so the market went up. And then we moved to where we live now, which is our dream home. So again, it's going back to what I said at the beginning.
Land and location.
Yeah, and also sacrifice. So your first home may not be exactly where you want to live, but if it's got the fundamentals, location, land, and looks, then you can dream of living in your dream home sometime in the future.
And it will only go up in value.
Yeah. And look, and you may not get all 3 L's, location, land, and looks, but you've got to get location right. I don't mind if you buy a small place in the right location, that's far better than buying a big house in the wrong location. Because you can never change location. That's why.
So we're obviously going back to our 3 L's: location, land and looks, and of course the sacrifice you had to make to get to where you are now.
That's right. And can I expand a little bit on location? So I just talked about suburbs, but it's not just about the suburb. It's also about the street. Like you can live in a lovely suburb, but you don't want to be living.
Horrible street.
Yeah, you don't want to be living on South Road in Myland or Torrensville, right? But there are some beautiful streets in Torrensville and Myland. Or you don't want to be living on Portrush Road. So I'm picking Adelaide examples here because that's where we're based, all right? So streets, you need to look at relatively wide streets and tree-lined. So you've got some trees, because that really sets the scene. That sets the picture for the whole area, the locale. Ideally, you want houses back from the front fence. That's not always going to be the case, but wide tree-lined streets, and if you can, buying the worst house in the best street is great, because all the other properties will tend to lift the value of your property. Yeah. Rather than buying the best house in the worst street. Because you think, one day, these houses are going to be knocked down. Well, they may not be, because the zoning may not allow it. Or maybe it's the government that owns the housing and they got no intention of selling that housing. So don't worry about if your particular house is not the nicest looking one, but if you bought into a nice street in a nice suburb, and that house that you bought has the fundamentals, like it's a decent sized block. Yeah. And if it's, character or period, even better. It's pretty hard to go wrong.
So location and land again.
Correct. I hope your listeners don't get sick of hearing that, but when you go to an open inspection, just keep that in your mind. Yeah.
So finally, Peter, can you give us some key locations that have that mix of affordability and growth potential for first home buyers in 2025?
I'm very happy you answered that question, Nicola, because a big part of my research is focused on gentrification. So gentrification is areas, typically blue-collar areas, and it might have been light industry that nobody wanted to live in before, but because of their proximity to the city or the sea and the high concentration of character or period style homes, they become very popular. So in Adelaide, St. Peter's, Norwood, Unley, Semaphore, Henley Beach, these are just some of the suburbs which 50, 60 years ago nobody wanted to live in. But now, because they are so close to the city or the sea and there's a high concentration of character or period style homes, they're quite expensive. Yep. Sydney, I already mentioned Paddington and Balmain. In Melbourne, it would be places like Richmond and St Kilda. Brisbane, it's the West End. So there are many examples of areas that have done really well. But if you're looking for areas to get into now in 2025 that will grow, keeping the fundamentals that we've just talked about. So in Adelaide, I'd be looking at some of the gentrifying inner western suburbs. For first home buyers in particular, Underdale, Richmond, Brooklyn Park, Hilton, Cowndilla. If you've got a bit more money, you can come in closer to the city and go to Torrensville and Thebarton. Down at beachside suburbs, O'Sullivan's Beach, Christie's Beach, Port Noarlunga South, Seaford, Moana. Yeah. Melbourne, gentrifying inner western suburbs, so I'd be looking at places like Footscray and West Footscray, or down on the Mornington Peninsula, Frankston, not Frankston North, but Frankston. Frankston South is actually quite expensive, or Seaford in Melbourne is another good suburb. In Sydney, Tempe and St Peter's, they're close to the other gentrifying suburbs such as Marrickville, which has done really well, which is where our current Prime Minister lives actually. In Brisbane, Wynnum on the coast. And when we look at Brisbane, I know we're not talking generally about investment here, but I've done some academic research on what happens to property in Olympic cities. And generally, from the time the Olympic Games are announced to the time the Olympic Games are held, property prices go up greater in value than other areas.
Because of the Olympics.
Yeah. And it's not just the 2 weeks of Olympic Games, it's all the new infrastructure that goes in, like all the train stations, all the new roads. All of this makes a locality more appealing. So the Olympics will be focused around Woolloongabba in Brisbane, but also around a beachside suburb called Manly, which is where a lot of the sailing is going to happen. And so if people look for undervalued suburbs around Woolloongabba or Woolloongabba itself, but that can be quite expensive, But there's a suburb called Wynnum in Brisbane, which is right next door to Manly. You can buy beautiful Queenslander-style homes. When I say beautiful, it's got great bones. Buying the renovated one means you can't add any more value. So buying something that needs a little bit of renovation is a great way to manufacture some equity or make some money. So I mean, Perth, Victoria Park, East Victoria Park, Carlisle, Canberra, I like Narrabundah. In Darwin, Milner, and in Hobart, it would be North Hobart, South Hobart, and Glebe. But look, if people look on the net, I've just written or contributed to an article on the best suburbs to invest in for realestate.com. So if they Google my name and top suburbs 2025, realestate.com, they'll find something. And then I did another one for, I think, savings.com.au.
Yeah.
But look, if you keep the fundamentals of buying close to the city or really close to the sea, and undervalued in very simple terms means the suburb is cheaper than the next door suburb. But you have to have a look at why it's cheaper. If it's cheaper because it's got lots of factories, for example, you don't want to be buying there. Good. But if it's very similar to the prime suburb, the next door suburb, in housing style and streetscape, then that could, even though it's a bridesmaid suburb now, it could be a terrific suburb in the future.
Yeah. So my biggest takeaway from this interview with you, Peter, is that the first thing you need to do is make a sacrifice to save for your deposit. Living in your first home is not always better than investing in your property. And then the 3 L's, land, location and looks. That will get you far. Is there anything else you would like to add, Peter?
I think you nailed it, Nicola. You know, if we're talking about the right types of locations, you've covered that with your summary. And properties, it's something with some land value, because it's the land that appreciates and
not
buildings.
The building.
Yeah, buildings How do we know that buildings depreciate? The tax man allows you depreciation on buildings, and after 50 or 60 years, often the house is knocked down because it's not worth as much as the land that it sits on. This podcast is just under an hour. If people want to learn more, there is an opportunity. So at university, I have developed a subject called Introduction to Property and Valuation. So, I mean, it's great for students that go to Adelaide Uni because they can pick it as an elective, but I have also made it a non-award subject. So anyone from the general public can enrol in that course, and they don't need an undergraduate degree, even though it's a component of the Master of Property, which is what I teach in. And they don't need to do any of the assessments either because it's non-award. They sit in class, they learn and they can ask questions. So it's PROP 7005 at Adelaide University, Introduction to Property and Valuation. If you don't live in Adelaide, that's okay because we stream the lectures, and I'm happy to get Zoom organised and you can join in the workshop online. And for Adelaide University students, there's no exam, I'd assume? Yes, and that's what they love. That's what the students love. When you're picking an elective, number one, is there an exam? No, there's not. See, I'll always do an elective with no exam. And the assessments are real life. So one is you're doing a video report on the suburb that you live in. Oh, okay. The main assessment is a valuation of your home. And I'm a bit old school. One of the assessments is you have to talk to me. I'm going to ask you questions and you have to answer them. So there's no ChatGPT, none of that rubbish. I want to know exactly what you know. And I think one of the most valuable components in the course is we go on a field trip. So I show you the best suburbs to live in or invest in, and the best types of properties, and also importantly, the worst types of properties to buy. So keep that in mind. PROP 7005, Introduction to Property and Valuation, if you want to know more. But this is the last year it's going to run, because next year when Adelaide University mixes with UniSA, when they merge, this course will not be offered again. So very good chance to get your very good chance to, I mean, other than, reading stuff on the net and listening to your wonderful podcast, there is an opportunity to do formal or semi-formal education where it's taught by not only people that talk the talk but walk the walk. So I'm not the only lecturer. Like we have a property lawyer that comes in that does property law. We have an accountant that talks about the tax and finance. We talk about property development, property investment, property valuation, and a little bit about commercial property. So look, for first home buyers, I mean, the commercial property stuff is probably not of interest. But for people who are looking to get into the property market, whether it's investing or a home, I think it's a very credible way to do it, because obviously Adelaide Uni is not going to be offering anything that's shonky. But have a look at that.
That sounds very interesting. I might actually look into doing that myself.
I look forward to seeing you in class, Nicola.
Thank you so much for this episode, Peter. It's been amazing and very insightful. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next week.